The IPP sentence and the Scottish IPP sentence, or the equivalent of the IPP in Scotland, which is the OLR, which a lot of people will probably not have heard about, which stands for an order for lifelong restrictions. But before I get into the video, just want to say a massive thanks to all my subscribers for your continuing support. And if you've noticed, I haven't had many videos on recently because I've been that busy with work and other things. It's just really hard to find the time to do these videos, especially with having 4 kids to look after at home. So it's trying to fit them in. But as you can see, I'm in my car. I've got a little bit of a journey to get up to the caravan because I'm away with the kids for the week. So I thought now's the time, while I'm stuck in a little bit of traffic as well, to get a video up and running. But the IPP sentence, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, the majority of you will, especially the ones that have been following my channel, which is an indefinite sentence for public protection, which is the same as a life sentence, a 99-year sentence. You could potentially stay in prison for the rest of your life on this sentence. And when you are released from prison, you're on license for the rest of your life, or until the parole board see fit that you don't need to be on it no longer. Which is 10 years after your first release, you can apply to the parole board. So you've got to have 10 years in the community of no trouble before you can apply. Well, you can apply to the parole board after 10 years to try and have your license scrapped and the sentence gone completely. But I'll just say a few facts about the IPP, because like I've just mentioned, a lot of people are not familiar with the sentence and they've never heard of it before. It was brought out, I think it was around about 2005, and it was meant to be reserved for the most dangerous of offenders. But it was given out, they were initially going to just give out 1,000 of these sentences, which, if they'd done them properly, they probably would have worked and there wouldn't be so much uproar at the minute with the IPPs. And they ended up giving out around about, I think it's 8,700 indeterminate sentences that were dished out between 2005 and 2012 when it was abolished. I think it might have come out a little bit earlier than 2005, but we'll just say around about then. And it was abolished in 2012 because this sentence was deemed inhumane and barbaric. And these are the words from the people that actually brought the sentence out, who was David Blunkett, who says he has sleepless nights, and he says it's the biggest regret of his life bringing out these IPPs, because it was him when he was in Labour that actually brought the IPP out. And he's went on to say it's the biggest regret of his life bringing that sentence out, because he's actually seen what's happening afterwards. And now that he's no longer in charge, his hands are tied, he can't do anything about it. But he is trying to get things done behind the scenes, or he has in the past. And this sentence, which was abolished in 2012, some 11 years ago, is still ongoing. So it was abolished, meaning that they will no longer give that sentence out, but the ones already serving the sentence, which was the ones that most of them, the majority, were in prison, the ones serving the sentence, and even the ones out on release, excuse me, that got released, the sentence was not retrospective across the board, meaning that everyone who was already given an IPP stays on the IPP. It stays with them for life, or until, like I've just mentioned, they did bring a new rule out where after 10 years you can apply to the parole board, but you've got to have been squeaky clean. Then there is a lot of people, I think there's been over 100 now, maybe it's a couple of hundreds, that have actually had the IPP scrapped completely, went through the parole process, because you've still got to go through the parole process out here in the community, and they decide whether or not you can have your license removed. And then once the license is removed, the sentence is removed completely and it can't be reinstated. But again, like I've mentioned, in 2012, when it wasn't the same for everybody, there is a lot of families of the IPPs, especially the ones that have committed suicide, that could no longer see a way out, because out of the IPPs, there's over 80 committed suicide whilst in prison. There's a lot, actually, believe it or not, there's a lot of, I've never really mentioned these ones before either, I don't know the statistics, but there's a lot of IPPs out here in the community who have also took their own lives because they were in fear of recall, which is constant when you're on life license. You're in fear, or you're capable, or you're not capable, sorry, you're at risk of recall at any point whilst you're on license. And a lot of these people that have committed suicides in the community, they think that the battle is getting out of prison. Once you're out of prison, the battle continues. The IPP nightmare is ongoing, it continues. And these people who've committed suicide out here in the community must have been that much in fear of recall, or just the conditions that are laid on them, and they couldn't get on with the life, move on with the life, so they've went and took their own lives out here in the community. But at the minute, there's been a lot of action in the news. Shirley de Bono, one of the campaigners for the IPPs, had a meeting with the head of the United Nations torture. Forgetting what our title was there. She was the head of the United Nations, to something to do with torture, and she was even in the news talking about the IPP, talking about how much they couldn't believe that this sentence was actually brought out in the UK, and it was ongoing and they haven't done nothing about it. And these campaigners, like I've mentioned, Shirley de Bono, Donna Mooney, they all deserve praise, because these are all the ones that have campaigned for us, and these are the ones that are getting things brought to the attention of the public and getting them in front of the House of Commons and trying to get us all resentenced and get something done about it. But there is hope, because the new Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, he wasn't for the IPPs when they first came out. He didn't want them to be brought out, and now that he's the one that's in power, he's the one that has the power to actually make a difference and change these IPPs and try and get everybody resentenced or do something about it. There is a bit of hope now that he's in power, because he's dealt with IPPs before, and I think he used to be a barrister or a QC, so he will hopefully have a better insight into the IPPs and see if there's something he can do about them. But there is a lot of people getting released lately from the IPPs that have been in way beyond tariff. There's the one just recently from up here in the northeast, which is Danny Weatherson, and he spent 18 years in prison on a short tariff. It was less than 2 years, I think it was around about 21 month IPP when he was 17-year-old, so he could have been out when he was about 18, 19, and 36-year-old I think he is now. He's been in prison for 18 years on a 21-month IPP sentence, and he's just been released. But there's another bit of good news as well, because there's a lass off one of the Facebook pages that I follow, IPP, Petition for IPP's Families. A few of the different Facebook groups which is there to help IPPs and to help families of IPPs, just to get support from each other. I'm on these pages quite a lot, and like I've just mentioned, a lass from further down the country has been in touch, telling us of the good news that a brother, after 18 years, has had his parole board approved, and it's been stamped by the Justice Secretary, and he is due to be released. I think he's getting released in January. You're probably waiting until January, because once you get released from IPP, sometimes if you've been in that amount of time, it's probably nearly 90% of the time, when you've been in that amount of time, they will not just release you straight from prison to your family, even though you might have a caring family at home waiting for you to come home to take care of you after all those years. He's got to go into a hostel, But again, hostels, another story which has set you up to fail in my eyes, because they're putting you in amongst people that are, well, they're putting you in danger, because they're putting you into a hostel which is full of people that are using drugs, and someone that's getting out of prison who could be clean, and they might have had a former addiction, and they're putting them into these sort of environments, which is another challenge for them. The challenge of they've spent all these years in prison, and then now they're getting out to be put into a hostel, which is another dangerous situation, surrounded by people that are coming in off their heads on drugs, mortal drunk, and then you've got to cope with that sort of behaviour when you've been in prison for 18 years. But the good news, like I've mentioned, his name's James Fryer. I've got permission off his sister to mention him. She's already spoke with him on the phone. Obviously, he must be mentioning my channel because she watches me podcasts and my YouTube. And he's done 18 years. He went into prison when he was 17-year-old. And again, his tariff, I forget what you said, it was less than 2 years. See, it was around about 20 months again. And he was 17-year-old. Similar story to Danny. Now, James went into prison for robberies. There was no violence, there was no weapons. And the robberies were on taxi drivers. Him and his friends, when they were 17-year-old, round about 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, when they're sitting, had a few drinks, drunk, and they're looking for more money to get more drink or whatever. And they were ringing taxis up to the house where they were sitting at, and they would go around the side of the house, and they would go and threaten the taxi driver and try and get money off him. But there was no, like I've mentioned, there was no weapons involved. I think they were just verbally threatening taxi drivers, saying, hand over your money. And he got done with 4 robberies, I believe. Laura will correct us in the comments if I'm wrong. But he got done with 4 robberies. 2 of them he wasn't present, or he wasn't seen. And the other 2, obviously, he was involved, but he wasn't the lead role. He was just there whilst the other lads were threatening the taxi driver. And of course, people will be watching it and think, well, that's a bad crime, doing something like that to report a taxi driver at that time in the morning off a bunch of young'uns. A taxi driver would have been scared stiff. But again, of course he would have been, and these people doing the IPP won't be sitting there saying, well, I didn't deserve prison. They deserved a prison sentence. We all did for doing what we did. No one disputes that. But doing something like that at 17-year-old, which a lot of people living on rough estates, council estates and stuff, it just, stuff like that happens all the time. But I'm not minimising the offence or anything like that. What I'm saying is, 17-year-old doing something stupid like that when you're drunk, when you don't really give a care when you're that age, you're not thinking about your actions or what you're causing or anything like that. But in his head, a lot, when you're pissed up at that age, you'll be thinking that you're not really doing anything wrong, you're not thinking straight, you're not thinking you're going to spend the next 18 years in prison, that's for sure. But I've been telling his sister he's kept his head straight throughout his sentence. I don't know the reasons why he's been in for the full 18 years, and I don't know whether or not he's been out within the 18 years and been recalled. I don't think he has. But I will be getting Laura and hopefully James on in the future to do a podcast about the IPPs, just to shed more light on them, just to get more people aware of these IPPs. But again, he was 17-year-old, he was drunk when he's done it, and he could have been out when he was 18, 19-year-old, which might have been a shock for him. He might have went in, done a year or 2 years and thought, because a lot of people do, you get your head straight when you go to prison. You think, when you're in a sober head, and you think, fucking hell, what was I doing when I was that age, or when I was pissed up? I didn't really care about what I was doing. He could have come out and sorted himself out and went on to have a good life. But like I've mentioned, 18 years later, he's just getting his release now. He's not even out yet, but he's getting released, and he's out in January, which is for the IPPs and the IPPs families. It's a lot of hope for the rest of the lads and lasses still serving this sentence in prison, because there's over 1,000 IPPs that have never been released that are 10 years over tariff as well, which is a massive amount, a staggering amount. But for the ones waiting for us to talk about the OLR, which a lot of you haven't heard of, and I hadn't really heard of it myself until maybe in the beginning of the year, when one of my Scottish subscribers mentioned it on the IPP video that I was doing. He actually went on to say, we've got that up here, it's just called something different. So when I've looked into the sentence and had a look into the background of it, the OLR, which I just mentioned, stands for an order of lifelong restriction, which them 3 letters should have just been IPP. Because when the IPP was coming into force, the Scottish government didn't agree with it and they didn't want it in their country. So they didn't vote for it and it didn't get brought into the Scottish prison system. So the IPP is in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. But like I've mentioned, Scotland didn't vote in for this IPP. But when I've looked into it, sneakily behind the scenes, they went on to get their own sentence, which was the OLR, which is exactly the same as an IPP. If you're deemed dangerous to the public, only I think up in Scotland they might have used this sentence a lot more wisely, and they might have used it a lot more sensibly than what they did with the IPP. Because the OLR, I think there was around about 200 since it was brought out. There's around about 237 since 2006. Now I think it was introduced in 2006, bearing in mind the IPPs were brought out around about 2005. So after the IPPs, the Scottish government must have thought, we need to have something like this. So they brought in the OLR and they've given out to over 200 people. And I believe there's not very many people out of the 200 being released since it was introduced. And I still believe they're still dishing out this sentence now. This sentence still exists. It's not like the IPP where it's been abolished and they're campaigning for it. The OLR is, from what I've looked at, seems to be going under the scenes. And what I mean by under the scene is it's not broadcast in the public, it's not talked about in the papers, and it's not brought to the attention of the public the way the IPP is. Now the OLR, when it was brought out since 2006, the release rate, which means when you go up for your parole hearing, I think with the IPPs it was something around about 70-80%. Now when you go for, you've got a 70-80% chance of release, where the OLRs compared to the IPPs is at 10%. And I think it was round about, if I'm wrong, any of the Scottish subscribers can correct us in the comments, but I think when I read up on it, there's only been about 20 people released on license on the OLR. But the difference with the OLR, it seems a lot stricter and a lot harsher than the IPPs, which you will find hard to believe, seeing as though the IPPs is in the limelight and they've been abolished. The OLR, with it being a 10% chance of release when you're going up for your parole, that's a very, very minimal chance that you're going to get released when you're going up for your parole. But with this one, there is no chance of getting your license scrapped after 10 years. You're on it for, as it says, lifelong restrictions. So you're at risk of recall for the rest of your life. And then again, it's a 99-year sentence. But I came across it because like I've mentioned, one of my subscribers mentioned it, and I've looked into a couple of cases, and I'm going to be doing some videos on them next week. I was going to say something there, but I'll not reveal too much. I'll leave that till next week, so if you do want to keep an eye out for my videos next week, if you're not already subscribed, go down, hit the subscribe button. It's free of charge, and hit that notification bell so you'll get a notification when my next video comes up. I'm going to talk about a case who's serving the OLR sentence. But I just thought I would mention that because, again, no one, especially down here in England, has heard about these OLRs. I'm IPP myself, and I've never heard of the OLR sentence until it was brought to my attention by one of my subscribers. But like I've mentioned, that sentence, I think, because there's only been like over 200, which is a small amount compared to the 8,700 IPPs that were given out. But maybe that sentence was brought out and it's been given to the right type of people, which if the IPP was brought out and given to the right type of people, instead of giving out little tariffs to people that shouldn't have never have had a small tariff, should never have been given the IPP. The IPP was abused, that's why it's been abolished. They gave too many out. If they gave it out like they were supposed to, it would have been used properly, or it should have been used properly, and it would have worked. That's what I was meant to say. It would have worked if it was brought out properly and given to the right type of offenders, instead of giving it to people that have not committed violent offences or sexual offences, and then they wouldn't have went on to spend so much time in prison. Because when you're given a short tariff of between 6 months and 3 years even, that's not enough time for you to get your courses done before you come up for your parole hearing. A lot of people that are in prison for murder are actually released before IPPs. Because if someone is sentenced to life with a recommendation of 12 years, it doesn't matter if you don't do anything in the first 5 or 6 years or mess around in the first part of your sentence. If you don't, like I say, comply with prison rules and stuff on your life sentence for the first 2, 3, 4, 5 years, then you calm yourself down in the prison, and then you go on to do your courses and you show that you've changed. These people that were serving time for murder of getting out after 12, 13, 14 years, whereas somebody who's IPP, you might be thinking, well, how come someone's in for 18 years? But when they're getting a knockback and they're saying, say they've done 2 years on the first time, right? They come up for the parole, they get a 12-month knockback. They might think, oh, well, I'll get out on my next one, so I don't really have to do much. But this is an ongoing occurrence, year after year, every 12 months, or 12 to 18 months, however long the knockback is. So every 12 months, these prisoners are thinking, oh, well, I'll probably get out on my next one. I'll go and try and do a course. Well, you can't get on the courses because there's waiting lists, sometimes 2 or 3 years, to get on the course. Whereas someone who's doing a life sentence for murder, they've got 12 years at a minimum to get the act together, get the courses done, and show that they've changed or show that they've reduced the risk by doing courses. And that's why a lot of these lifers are getting out on the tariffs of 12 years or whatever, the short-term tariff, the minimum term tariffs for murder. And like I've mentioned, these are getting out before the IPPs, which people can't find or can't see the reasoning behind it. But the reasoning is because what I've just described there. If the IPP's on a short tariff, every year they're thinking that they're going to be getting out in 12 months' time. So 12 months comes round and they keep getting knocked back. But then by the time 10 years has passed, the mental health has deteriorated and they're getting kept in prison, not because they're at risk of serious harm to the public, but because they're suffering with the mental health, and the mental health is then keeping them back. But the mental health is caused off the IPP. So how can it be justified that they were keeping you in prison to start with because they were saying you were dangerous? But now that they think that you're no longer a danger, but because you've been in prison so long, your mental health has deteriorated, but they won't release you onto the streets because your mental health has gone that low, they're now thinking you're at risk because of your mental health. And a lot of these lads that have been refused parole, and lasses, I keep saying lads, but it's lads and lasses, when they've been refused parole that many times, they're getting the knockbacks. And after 8 years, I met a lad that had been in 8 years on a 4-year tariff, and he hadn't used drugs, he'd kept his head down. But he couldn't take it no longer, so he turned to drugs as a coping mechanism, and that was the reason why they kept knocking him back, because when he was coming up for his next parole, he'd been using drugs, and they wouldn't release him. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was using drugs in prison, so they wouldn't release him. And another one is because some of the prisoners were inflicting pain on themselves because they couldn't see no end date, they couldn't see no end goal. They were getting knocked back all the time, so they then used a self-harm mechanism to cope with what they were going through. They were harming themselves because they couldn't see an end goal. And when you harm yourself in prison, it's classed as an act of violence. So now that someone has used, or someone has cut themselves with a razor blade, which is what they normally use in prison, because someone's cut themselves with a razor blade, they're then saying they've used violent tendencies and they've used an act of violence. Even though the act of violence is on themselves, they've now been classed dangerous because they used violence upon themselves. But when I've spoke with lads in prison serving IPP, and I've actually questioned them, and I said, what's the reason behind why are you cutting yourself so bad? Because there was one lad that cut himself every part of his body, even cut big chunks out of his face and everything. I said to him, I said, why are you doing it? And he said, so it makes him feel as if it makes him feel alive. When he feels the pain, that's when he realises that he's actually still alive, because he's living that nightmare. And that was the reason why some of them are doing it. And some of them are doing it because they're actually trying to take their own lives. And some of them are doing it because they're, like I've just mentioned, they want to feel the pain. Because they're going through so much pain, because it can't be released. And it can't be released because of their mental health. And some of them are hearing voices. Some of them have got schizophrenia. Some of them have got really bad mental health problems because of being in prison for that long. They didn't have these problems when they went into the prison. The prison and the IPP has actually created these problems and created the mental health. And they're cutting themselves because of the pain they're going through, and they're wanting to feel even more pain because they want to punish themselves, because probably for putting themselves in that situation, but they want to punish themselves and show people what they're actually doing. But that is the reason why some of them are still not getting released from prison, because they're using acts of violence upon themselves. But and I'm sure it's probably the same with the OLR, because these type of sentences that they're dishing out, or what they were dishing out, the IPP is no longer. 2012 it was abolished, but the sentences that they were dishing out, which is being deemed barbaric and inhumane, has made people go to these extremes and using different acts of violence upon themselves. And like I've mentioned, 80 odd has committed suicide, and the only way they could see themselves getting out of prison was in a wooden box. That was the only way they could see in their minds that they would ever be free, was by taking their own lives and leaving the prison gates in the back of a hearse or in the body bag, getting let out of the prison. A free person, but a dead person. But I'm going to leave it there on that note, and I will be bringing it to the attention more and more about these IPPs, because again, a lot of people haven't heard about them. And even though it's quite disturbing, some of the stuff that I'm talking about the IPPs, about killing themselves and what they've done to themselves, a lot of people find it interesting, and they want updates about what's happening. And I know a lot of my viewers and subscribers are actually IPP that have been released, and they're living out in the community, and they are finding strength and inspiration from my videos. So to all you people out there now doing IPP, don't give up, keep pushing on. Something will happen with the IPP sooner or later, and hopefully it'll be sooner, and sooner we'll get resentenced and get rid of this IPP nightmare for good. But thanks for watching, people. Hope you enjoy your weekend. Stay safe and be careful, and keep an eye out for that video that I'll be doing next week, talking about the OLR up in Scotland. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.